Morning to everyone. Welcome. We're glad that you made it out today. I think we might be able to actually say that this is the first day of fall. It's only supposed to get up to 81 instead of 124, and I don't know that we'll ever have winter, but at least it's pretty pleasant outside. And we're really happy to have you here for another session of our Tempe History Society Lunch Talks. That's a program that we've been doing for a number of years, and we are delighted that for at least 5 of those years, I've lost track of time, Friendship Village has sponsored these lunch talks. And that really gives us some resources that help improve what we're able to attract, and we really want to thank Friendship Village. Mark Young is usually here. He's Director of Marketing for Friendship Village, but he's got another commitment today, and so we've got some folks from Friendship Village. Yay! Fantastic. We always thank you for coming out to these lunch talks. Got a lot of news to give to you, but I think I'll hold back on that until we conclude the program today. And also, has everybody had a chance to, were you either here last month or seen online our presentation from Dan Harkins last month? You can let friends know that that's available on Facebook, the Tempe History Society Facebook page and the museum's Facebook page. We are now able to archive all of these presentations, so anytime you want to re-watch it or let some other folks know who said, oh, I'm sorry I missed that one, they are up online now. So today we're going to welcome Dr. Anthony Pratchet II, and Dr. Pratchet is an Arizona native. Any natives here? Really? Wow. That's a good number. Wow. Dr. Pratchet is a historian here in the Salt River Valley. He is currently teaching ethnic studies at Northern Arizona University. In addition to, are you still with the Barrett Honors College? No, he's just up at NAU. So if you feel you need to expand your academic education, go up to NAU. You'll be able to take one of his classes. He was at the Barrett Honors College for a number of years at Arizona State University, and he was part of the Center for African American Urban Studies and the Economy in the Department of History at Carnegie Mellon University and at the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity in America at Brown University. Local fellow, he is a proud graduate of Deer Valley High School in Glendale, Arizona. Not quite up to snuff of all of the Tempe high schools. Thank you. I was supposed to, I was instructed to say that, but it is a fine school in its own right. And he serves on the board of directors at the George Washington Carver Museum and Cultural Center in Phoenix. I could tell you a lot more about him, but I think it's better to listen to the presentation than to have me read his entire biography, which would only take up a small telephone book. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Anthony Pratchet.
Good morning, everyone. Before I get started, I do have to say, when I was at the Honors College, I would have a lot of students who would come into my office and they would say, "Oh, I'm from DV." And I'm like, "I went to DV too." And they're like, "Yeah, Desert Vista." I'm like, "No, not that DV." Yeah, but it's good to be here today. It's a blessing to be able to commune with you all, have an opportunity to share some of the work that I've been doing. I want to start by thanking Dr. Christine Marin for the invitation to come here. And also, as well as the African American Advisory Committee here at the museum for inviting me as well, making it possible for me to come share this work with you, with Dr. Marine in particular. Part of the reason I'm so happy to be able to share this work with you all is because of the work that she has done. Her archival collection, while it focused on Chicano history at ASU, it's been able to preserve stories of Arizonans of all shades and colors. And so it's out of that type of legacy that I see my work is trying to continue to fill that type of gap. When I consider Black history in Arizona, or Chicano history, or Tempe history, I would argue that we should consider this the history of all Arizonans. And this isn't, to water down or wash out the specificity of our particular heritage or backgrounds or ancestries, but it's more so to show how the unique stories of each of these individual communities is connected to the broader story of us all. So while preparing for my remarks today, as I do when I come to Tempe, I couldn't help but consider the pioneers that laid a path for African Americans to be able to contribute to our presence here in this community. Ancestors known and unknown, but we begin always with Moses Green. Moses Green, he was the first African American birth recorded in territorial Arizona. According to Jared Smith, here at the Tempe History Museum, a curator and also the author of The African American Experience in Tempe, Green spent most of his life in Arizona working in food service. In fact, he eventually served as secretary for the Cooks and Waiters Union, but he kept a permanent address in Tempe. His mother, Mary Green, is recognized as the first African American woman to own land in what is currently Tempe, and more so she's understood as the first African American to reside in the Salt River Valley. Here's a little clip, if it'll play for us, that I did with the city of Phoenix pertaining to the history of Mary Green. We'll see if it comes through. Oh, I know what the issue is actually. There was one thing I forgot to troubleshoot before we got started, and that was the Wi-Fi. Okay. Let me unplug this real quick. Just minimize it? Okay.
Yeah, I forgot about the Wi-Fi. Should be somewhere down the bottom, maybe, no, right there. Yeah, it's the Tempe Public. Yeah. We disconnect and then connect it again. Yeah. And then Tempe and their free Wi-Fi is awesome. It is awesome. I just have to set it up. So there you go. So
Awesome, thank you.
Perfect. And that should be popping up.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you to the Tempe History Museum, Brianna in particular, for not just the invitation of coming here, but also the fantastic work they do. This is definitely, as a connoisseur of local history, one of the premier historical venues in the Valley. So it's really a blessing that we're able to be here today. All right, let's see if we can get this working now. One of the first families to move here is the Green family. Mary Green, the matriarch, she was an enslaved woman who followed her previous owners from Arkansas after the Civil War. She arrived in the Valley in 1868. She worked for the Gray family as a domestic. But moreover, her children were the first African American children to live here. In fact, her son was the first African American child to be born. Okay, well, in that sense, let's move forward. So the point is that there is a long legacy of the Green family here in the Salt River Valley, from Mary Green to Moses Green, especially here in Tempe. But there's a sadness, I find, that permeates their history. So Mary Green passes of tuberculosis around the time of Arizona statehood, and according to Smith, her son disappears from the historical record after 1930. And so their descendants, they may still be here with us, but without tombstones or monuments to celebrate their pioneering efforts, the Greens haunt Tempe through unverifiable gossip and conjecture passed down through an oral tradition. So as a child growing up in the West Valley, I found this type of retrospective to be uninspiring and depressing. It drove me away from studying my people, honestly. I couldn't see a narrative beyond the allegorical mythology, which defines anonymous death as the predestined fate awaiting pioneers from our community. The moral of this story, I believe, is made clear in the legacy of Esteban. He was an enslaved Moor, widely recognized as the first non-indigenous person to traverse what we now call Arizona. Born Mustafa Azamuria, he joined the ill-fated Narvaez expedition in the early 16th century and led the famed conquistador Cabeza de Vaca on a daring decade-long odyssey from modern-day Tampa Bay, so on the Gulf Coast of Florida, all the way to Mexico City, several thousand miles. Contemporary scholars such as Dennis Herrick, they've argued that Esteban, due to his skills as a multilingual medicine man, he was the primary intercessor between Spanish colonizers and the indigenous parties they encountered along their trek. And so, in this sense, their survival, European survival, depended on his innate talent and charms. And after his successful sojourn across North America, Esteban led Franciscan friar Marcos de Niza across southeastern Arizona during their journey to find the legendary 7 cities of Cibola. However, after meeting with Pimas from the Salt River Valley, Esteban mysteriously disappeared in modern-day New Mexico, leaving behind tales of a violent demise by Zuni chieftains, frightened that he would bring misfortune to their homes. His body remained unrecovered, and of course, he left no records to prove or even to disprove any of the claims that were made about him. So while he has an inspiring narrative, it still ends despite his intrepid ingenuity and despair. He remained enslaved, far from friends and family, without historical records to memorialize his perspective. He remains filtered through colonial texts due to our ambiguous understanding of his legacy. A similar story can be told about Henry O. Flipper, the first African-American graduate of West Point, whose dishonorable discharge on fraudulent allegations is a blemish on our military's history. He was never able to clear his name. It was only through support from white Southerners after he passed that this injustice was rectified decades after he left this mortal coil. However, his civilian record, I argue, is comparable to that of Esteban. After his discharge, Flipper settled as a bachelor in southern Arizona with the belief that people were not so, quote, prejudiced and mean as they are in the South. However, after the land fraud associated with the Peralta grant, this is an incredible story that we're not going to get into today. It will be need to be recited another day. Anita Huizar Hernandez at Arizona State University, she's written a really great story on it. But the long and short, basically about 1/8 of the state was claimed under a fraudulent land claim by a couple of people who said that it had been deeded to them through Spanish royalty. And what would have happened then is that the people in that area would have lost ownership over the land that they had been homesteading or living on. So a federal court of private claims was established at this time to determine who had clear legal title on land tenure in southern Arizona. So since Flipper was fluent in Spanish, he was hired by government lawyers to translate thousands of title documents, and he helped distinguish authentic land claims from fraudulent evidence. When the Los Nogales de Elias grant, as it would have obliterated land claims in the epimonious southern Arizona town, it came before the court. Flipper was the only witness government lawyers needed to stake their claim. His legitimacy from extensive surveying experience in Mexico led to a rapid judgment against fraudulent grant holders and in favor of the people of Nogales. And so I argue that if anything, Flipper should not be remembered for his military discharge, but for his skilled civic service to the people of Southern Arizona, and as a pioneer who made his community better for all. And this is where I've had to refocus my energies as I moved into my professional years, on how our forebears persevered as torchbearers for social justice through civic engagement. And this is what I like to refer to as the duality of history. In many ways, there is a darkness, especially when it comes to understanding the African American story here in the Southwest. But there's also a light that comes with it. And so the question is, how do we reframe our focus from focusing on the more painful issues of the past? Not to forget them, but to find what can illuminate a brighter future for us moving forward. To do this, let's consider the case of Samuel Bostic. He was one of the wealthiest African Americans in territorial Arizona. Bostic rose from slavery to become the most prominent member of Tucson's minuscule black community after his arrival in 1861. In 1860, less than a decade after the Gadsden Purchase completed the annexation of the American Southwest, there were 21 African Americans in what became Arizona. And a decade later, in 1870, there were still only 26 African Americans enumerated across the territory. And 9 of these number in 1870, a majority of whom were of mixed race ancestry. They lived in Tucson. And this number would have likely have been even less without Bostic. As I said, he had been born into slavery during the 1830s, but began his adulthood working towards emancipation on the violent Kansas frontier. By 1868, after several years in the Old Pueblo, he had leased a barbershop from the Higuera family. And after they sold their interest to Hampton Brown, another African-American investor, Bostic was able to acquire ownership over the entire building. So by this point, Bostic had regular advertisements for his services in Anglo newspapers. And since he was firmly ensconced in the community, he acquired financing to open a restaurant and the first public bathhouse in Tucson. One of the ways I would then describe this is, imagine you're in the Old West, you're traveling through Tucson, it's hot, it's dusty, you need a place to clean yourself. There were no public facilities for people to refresh themselves until Samuel Bostic, a runaway enslaved person who emancipated himself in the Southwest, was able to put together the financing to build this type of civic infrastructure for the entire community. So westward migration in this sense transformed his fortunes, but it also wound up enriching the community in which he lived. Bostic was able to achieve this status through multiracial relationships. Anti-miscegenation statute should have prohibited his marriage to a Soronese woman, Albina Barraga, but both Anglos and Mexicos were witnesses at their Catholic wedding, and an American judge oversaw the ceremony. His personal relationship with the Mexican community helped augment his business relationships with the Anglo community. In addition to his urban holdings, he owned a 160-acre homestead in an adjoining county and a partnership in 10 acres along a road to a military installation south of Tucson. And he had a personal estate worth over $500, including cash. By 1870, Bostic had amassed assets worth over $2,000 in value. Moreover, his ownership sustained racial integration within a multiracial city. His bathhouse was located on prime real estate, near law offices and a drugstore, and provided housing for Black, Anglo, and Mexican workers. Nearly half the African Americans in town found accommodations in one of his buildings, and he also leased the Shoe Fly restaurant, which had gained great renown among Anglo travelers, and hosted many leading politicians in the territorial government. His customers were able to order meals at the restaurant as part of their patronage at his establishment. And so despite his recent emancipation, he swiftly came to own several of the foremost establishments in the Old Pueblo. And it was through his connection with communities both within and beyond the African American community that he was able to accomplish this status. But Bostic, he would go on to be so ambitious that he became the first African American to run for elected office in territorial Arizona. He ran as an independent candidate for the position of public administrator in Pima County in 1870. In this role, he would have overseen estate management for probate court cases. This position at the time proved ripe for corruption, and racial minorities were often vulnerable to exploitation by public administrators who would defraud their estates for personal gain. His independent campaign alienated Anglo citizens from both political parties. 1870 is a seminal election in American history. It was the first time that the 15th Amendment had guaranteed that voting rights could not be abridged on the basis of racial identity or previous servitude. So in Arizona, this meant that Black, Chinese, ethnic Mexicans, and indigenous men, they were all eligible voters regardless of local franchise prohibitions. Republicans had cultivated an electoral base among the ethnic Mexican community, as Territorial Governor Richard C. McCormick had relocated the state capital to Tucson over outcries from Anglo settlers in northern Arizona. He had also encouraged suffrage for indigenous Arizonans granted citizenship under the Republic of Mexico. This approach stood in contrast with local Democrats who argued that Republicans' reliance on ethnic Mexican and indigenous voters corrupted electoral results and boldly asserted that, quote, no Negroes or Chinamen should be allowed access to the ballot. So although a candidate from the People's Party, which was a local variant of the Republican Party, handily won the election, Bostic offered voters an alternative to what was seen at the time as corrupt Republicans or racist Democrats. These issues, though, of inclusion in particular, they would only be exacerbated after statehood. The transition from the territorial period to statehood brought de jure racial segregation into Arizona. This policy limited opportunities for Black Arizonans, even as it created a segregated economy that sustained entrepreneurship and innovation in their community. During the early 20th century, African American entrepreneurs etched out claims across Arizona in pursuit of something of their own. In southern Arizona, under the leadership of J.W. Miller, the Afro Mining Company sold stock in their operations and hired local school children to build a mining shaft for a mining venture. This company continued until the sudden death of its founder. Black migrants also established towns, but their precarity due to segregation left homesteaders vulnerable to Anglo predations. This is a picture up here of McNairy, Arizona. McNairy is actually a company town. It's a lumber town to the northeast of here. It's up in Gila County, I believe. I believe it's Gila County. It's over near Sholo. But McNairy, the lumber company, they originally had come from Louisiana. And when they realized opportunities that were out here, they encouraged their labor force to follow the company westward. So if you know anything about Louisiana, you'd know that many of those timber workers were people of African descent. And so the town of McNairy in rural Arizona wound up being a largely African-American town, despite the fact that it was multiracial in many ways, but there was a large African-American contingent in the area that resided there for quite a long time in the 20th century. Additionally, there's the town of Booz Wash off of the US 60 between Brenda and Hope in La Paz County. This was a piece of land that was sold to African-American migrants from Los Angeles in 1925 by two white surveyors, claiming that they would sell these Black churchgoers good homesteading land. Mrs. Rosie Riley, one of the homesteaders, she claimed to have learned about the land at church and stated, quote, two white fellows came to our services in Los Angeles and told our people they had located some good homesteading land. They said they would survey it, let out the section lines, all this for $1 an acre. They also promised to dig wells until an irrigation canal was built. None of these services were provided. These con men defrauded these families of their investment and escaped unscathed. The land which they had acquired, since it was in a wash, as you can see in this picture above, taken a little bit earlier this year, it was in a wash, so it flooded during heavy rains. One of the last standing pioneers in the area reflected on his experience, saying, I came here to be a farmer, but they wouldn't even write insurance on us. We couldn't even borrow money enough to bring in water or buy equipment. People came here with a dream of having their own land and being their own boss. It was terrible for us. So, as I said, going back to the idea of the duality of history, on one hand, there is opportunity, especially for Black migrants in coming to the Southwest, but there's also peril in the sense of having to navigate the racism, the isolation, and the inhospitability of the social climate as well as the desert itself. But still, migrant farmers continued to stream into the state during the early 20th century, seeking employment, and they settled often on the periphery of urban areas when farm labor evaporated. Jewel Freeman, as an example, was part of a wagon train that set out in cold, rainy January weather, and over that next 8 months made their way from Oklahoma City to Arizona. She remembered that, quote, "We'd catch a good day by a pool of water and do our washing. Then we'd have a worship service before we moved on," end quote. In many places, they survived due to the charity of people along their path and homesteaded a small farm along the way until arriving in Safford in northern Arizona to run a small cotton farm with pigs, cattle, and chickens. Such providence and persistence were common among black migrants to Arizona. But even more than working class families, you have black professionals who developed valuable businesses and black workers who performed significant labor during the segregated interwar periods. Winston and Abra Hackett, they're two of the leading contributors to the community during this time. Originally from Texas, they moved to Phoenix during World War I, and although Winston had completed medical studies at historically black colleges in the South, he worked in cotton fields until he saved enough money to purchase his medical license. Apocryphally, the story goes that he moved here with 75 cents in his pocket. And that's how he figured out how to pull himself up, I suppose, by the proverbial bootstraps. At this time, medical care was segregated in Arizona. And so the Hacketts developed the Booker T. Washington Hospital in East Lake Park at the former site of the territorial governor's mansion. This was a proprietary hospital, meaning that it was privately funded and run for profit. But this was because the state of Arizona refused to invest resources into segregated health care. That being said, their institution was seen as one of the finest colored hospitals west of the Mississippi. They worked together in this endeavor. Dr. Hackett treated any patient who would come to him, including Anglo patients seeking to hide treatment for venereal disease from socially more, basically people in their community, while Mrs. Hackett, Abra Hackett, worked as a midwife and served as the church mother as what is now known as First Institutional Baptist Church. They also built cottages for a sanitarium, making it possible for African American tuberculosis patients to find care despite segregation and exclusion. This is something that I think we all should remember, especially in lieu of, I suppose, a pandemic that we all just came out of. But that tuberculosis was the leading cause of death for Arizonan adults up through World War II. Respiratory illness, because of the climate, has been something that afflicts people who move here. Or shall I say it another way? Many people who move here have been afflicted by respiratory illnesses. And so the idea was that if you could move to the dry desert climate, this would provide respite from the wheezing and the coughing and the pulmonary issues that associate respiratory illness. But because of the prejudice against tuberculosis patients, because of public health concerns about having people with infectious diseases living within city limits, unless people had access to private tuberculosis care, many of them were forced to live outside of city limits, especially in Phoenix. I cannot say for sure on Tempe, but one of the ways that it would work during this time, because the towns were so small, people would just move out into the desert, they would set up tents, and they would live there and die there based on their ability to take care of themselves without access to a broader healthcare network. And so this is the work that the Hacketts moved to Arizona to do, to provide care for patients who were excluded from even the private charitable organizations at that time due to racial segregation. The infrastructure of the hospital they built eventually went on to form the foundation of Phoenix Memorial Hospital at 7th Avenue and Buckeye Road. And the sanitarium cottages that they built were eventually turned into housing for black troops during the Second World War. Their engagement with the community also encouraged other black professionals, including the first black dentist in Arizona, to move to the state and provide health care for people excluded from equal opportunity and access. And I would show it through the videos. I understand how the sound is here, so we're not. It is all the way up on the computer, I think, yeah. But, so while, Dr. Winston Hackett, he what he was able to accomplish was remarkable. His wife, Ira, she was also a legend in her own regard. She was the first Black woman to publish a newspaper in the state of Arizona. She had the Arizona Gleam. And one of the things that's so fascinating about the Gleam is what it focused on. So this is at a time when the Black community in particular is just largely excluded from the Arizona Republic or from Anglo newspapers. So there's very little record in this sort of sense of what's going on. Initially you have, I believe, it's the Phoenix Index. That's one of the first Black newspapers published in the Salt River Valley. You would also have the newspapers down at Fort Huachuca. They would publish things that were, say, going on nationally. So a large part of the goal at that time was to try to figure out how to tie the local Black community to, especially since so many of them were migrants, to trends going on across the country. But the Arizona Gleam focuses on the community in Phoenix. What Hackett did, she hired women to work as reporters. They would go to church services. They would go to social clubs. They basically would offer local residents an opportunity to see themselves reflected in the paper. And the reason that this type of work is so important is because at the time, she's putting a spotlight, she's putting a mirror on people who are being excluded from the broader discourse and conversation. What she's doing is showing the value of a community that was actively being devalued. And so the work, as I've said, of professionals such as the Hacketts, the work even of Black migrants who moved here, the work of Black workers, many of whom were working as domestics, as barbers, in making sure that the Salt River Valley was a place where a community could be built, not just for their community, but for all people, is fundamental, in my argument, to understanding the growth of metropolitan Phoenix from the early 20th century forward. So in the same vein as the Hacketts, and give me a second, we'll move through this, educators were also critical to the development of our local community, Black educators in particular. Segregated education limited educational opportunities for all students in Arizona, but Black students faced unique barriers due to the required segregation at the elementary level and optional segregation at the secondary level. This meant that Black students were often segregated from their classmates unless there were enough students in a district to justify the development of an independent school for children of color. In rural districts, one of the things that would happen is folks would be forced to sit on the other side of a screen when they got to high school or even in elementary school, or they would be forced to take classes outside the room. Many districts, instead of providing services for students, would pay for transportation so that students would have to leave their local area and then drive to another community where a school would be offered. As an example, the Roosevelt District, one of the reasons it was able to develop really, I should say, high quality segregated institutions was because the surrounding communities, if they did not have segregated schools themselves, would pay to send students, African American students, out of their district down to Roosevelt Elementary. So in that sort of sense, one of the things you saw at the time was a practice not just of exclusion, but really ostracization, even when people were brought into educational facilities. But there were, as I say here, there's reports of districts who would have to hire a tutor, in particular, to teach a handful of students of color within their districts to abide by the state statute, which when you think about it is not the worst thing to have a private tutor, but it was, I digress. Moreover, while some high schools were segregated, students and even at desegregated high schools, students would face culturally insensitive students, faculty, and administrators upon arrival. And even though African American students matriculated into our state universities around 100 years ago, racial segregation separated Black students from many of their Anglo peers. At Arizona State Teachers College, Black students were unable to eat in the cafeteria, live in the dorms, and while some participated in sports, most were forced to commute from Phoenix to participate in course activities up until after World War II. But there were a vanguard of Black educators who ensured that their pupils received the best education they could provide. Wilson C. Riles, according to the Southside Community Association in Flagstaff, was principal of the Southside's Dunbar School from 1947 to 1954. The first Black student enrolled at NAU, and also a migrant from Louisiana, so while he did not live in McNary, he was part of that migration. of black lumber workers who left Louisiana and moved to northern Arizona. He was the president of the NAACP up there and a radio talk show host. While he was orphaned at a young age, family friends stepped forward to act as his foster parents. And when they relocated to Arizona during the Great Depression, Riles joined them, enrolling in Arizona State Teachers College, now Northern Arizona University, in 1936. So by working a number of odd jobs, he was able to pay his college expenses and graduate in 1940 with a major in education and a minor in history. He was recruited by Miss Cleo Murdoch to work for the Dunbar School, the Colored Elementary School in Flagstaff. In 1952-1953, Riles and Superintendent Sturgeon Cromer, they worked to desegregate Flagstaff City schools. It was agreed that the segregated Dunbar School would close in May of 1954 at the end of the school year, and that Dunbar students would join other neighborhood students at the South Beaver School, which had been segregated for Mexican and Latino students and Native American students since the 1920s. Out of a job, Riles moved to Northern California and became California's Superintendent of Public Instruction for California in 1970, after working as a consultant for the Department of Education for around a decade. He was the first black person elected to statewide office in California. This is not part of the what should we call it, the PowerPoint, but I do think it's worth mentioning. His classmate at Arizona State Teachers College at that time was, does anyone remember our first Latino governor's name? Yes, it was Raul Castro. Thank you. Raul Castro was there. And there's this phenomenal picture of the two of them down at the state archives taking a picture together as the first African-American and the first Latino elected to statewide office in the representative states of Arizona and California during the mid-70s. It's a really remarkable photo. But part of the reason I think it's worth bringing up is because it gets to this point of remembering that Riles' story, while in many ways, I mean, he goes on to see his greatest successes outside of the state, but he's integral to understanding the community that was developing in Flagstaff at that time, where you had an opportunity for a multiracial group of forward-looking future military, veterans to come in and try to imagine a different future than the segregated one that they had inherited. And they would take this legacy on for the rest of their lives, Riles and Castro, until they both wound up serving in some of the highest offices in their respective states. So similar, in Tempe, students from the Okemah community struggled to navigate an education system originally designed to exclude their community. And that's until the arrival of Geneva Epps Mosley in 1960. A graduate of Arizona State University, Ms. Epps Mosley accepted a position as the first African-American instructor in Tempe Elementary District. She would be followed by other education professionals such as Jim Blose and Pearlie Mae Wadey, along with Dr. Laverne Swain Tarkington at the Union High School District. Dr. Tarkington in particular filled virtually every role that you could imagine as teacher, counselor, administrator, and district superintendent before her retirement around the turn of the century. And what I find interesting about Dr. Tarkington is that after all of her accomplishments, what she said she was most proud of is how she created a home for her descendants with her husband of more than half a century. And so there's this term that I learned as an undergraduate, Sankofa. It emerges from the Twi language of the Akan people in what is currently known as Ghana, and it's part of a phrase that means it is not wrong to go back for which you have forgotten. And so by this, what I think of is that we can't let the painful experiences of our pioneering ancestors blind us not just to the values that they held so dear, but the joy that they were able to experience as well. One of the amazing things about the work that I do is I have an opportunity to go into historic newspapers. One of my deepest joys, honestly, is just going into the archival collections and seeing what you can find. And so this clip from the Arizona Tribune in 1959 is discussing the growth of Julian School in Roosevelt District. And you can see here Miss Geneva Folks, a graduate of ASU Tempe, has been added to the primary teaching staff, which gives the school 6 first-grade teachers. And here in another clip from the Arizona Tribune is W.M. Mosley, 12, a 7th grader. I believe at this time they reported that he had gotten 17 A's on his report card. You can see him here playing in his front yard. And so one of the amazing things then when we really think about it is not just that these folks were able to blaze these trails that we're still following to this day, but that they were everyday regular people, just like you, like me, my students, the folks we see on the street. There is not really a difference between the pioneers of then and the people that we are today. So Arizona, going back to thinking of education, it was on the cutting edge of school desegregation. Hazel B. Daniels and Carl Sims, they were the first 2 black legislators elected to the State House in 1951. They were critical in overturning school segregation legislation that had separated students by race prior to that time. Arizona's state judge, Fred C. Strunkmeyer, in a case that provided precedent for the Brown v. Board decision that ended school segregation, he commented that, quote, 50 years of intolerance is enough, when he ruled against appeals to sustain segregation at Phoenix Union High School District. But what this wound up meaning then is that Arizona and its Carver High School in particular, which was one of the premier colored schools in the country at that time, wound up desegregating prior to federal legislation forcing the rest of the nation to come up with desegregation plans in 1954. Arizona, led by black legislators in this sense, was a pioneer on a path towards not just a more equal, but a more inclusive America, one that we are still living in today. This would be one of the first of many dominoes to fall in favor of African Americans, of black Arizonans. So by 1962, de jure discrimination had been eliminated in housing accommodations, meaning it was illegal to discriminate against people in housing accommodations on the basis of race. Still, it was virtually impossible for African Americans to acquire housing in suburban communities like Tempe or in the West Valley in Maryvale. But pioneers such as Willie and Florence Franklin, they would not be denied access to the opportunities such as schools, parks, malls, and hospitals available to suburban homeowners. The day before a hearing in Phoenix, before the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, where witnesses detailed damning evidence showing that the local FHA office had restricted access to property lists so that African American homebuyers could not purchase homes in suburban communities. The Franklins, they purchased a home in Maryvale by paying what is known as a black tax. It was essentially a transaction fee to out-of-state Anglo buyers willing to purchase a home on their behalf. It's very difficult in this sense to see, but this is the warranty deed for their purchase. What's fascinating when you do the title search on their particular home is that their transaction, I want to say, is less than 2 weeks before the previous transaction. It's a couple $1,000s more, but the difference is that the person who had previously bought their home had bought it from an Arizona family. The Arizona mortgage does not have an anti-discrimination clause within it. But since the home buyers were from another state, they wound up having a deed that was or financed by a Nevada bank. And the Nevada mortgage had an anti-discrimination clause in it, meaning that when they sold it to the Franklins, they were within their legal right to do so. There was no standing to prevent them from selling it because the financing that they had acquired had language that prevented discrimination within it. That being said, they still had to pay, as I said, a couple $1,000s of a transaction fee, something close to 15 to 20% of the total purchase of the home, in order to acquire property in that community. But they were inspired by investors such as Travis Williams, who developed a real estate firm that built homes for black veterans. His success also inspired white builders to end some of their informal restrictions against sales, realizing that they could acquire part of this market share. So what we wind up seeing after the civil rights movement of the 60s is that black Arizonans, when given an opportunity to compete equally with all others in the state, had the capacity to fare well or even better, or even exceed expectations set in front of them. And this changed the political landscape of the state by including African Americans in decisions where they had previously been excluded. This is one of my favorite maps of Phoenix. It's a conceptual map. What you can see here are all the different ways that we can understand the valley. If you look in that area between the 10, the 202, the 143, and the 101, what you see is Party Central, Bra. I think that's where we're at now. But a way of understanding perhaps the area of North Tempe or South Tempe, which we can see is the Sacred in Chandler, Sacred Yaquis, and another big mall. But also the far west valley, near Tres Rios, over near the confluence of the Salt River and the Agua Fria, from Alfalfa to Bedrooms. Or west of the 101, or east of the 101, excuse me, between the 101 and the 87. This land is our land, not yours. Come play at our casinos. What we wind up seeing then over the period that African Americans are brought into metropolitan Phoenix is that the landscape changes from the valley being seen in many ways as, quote, the whitest big city in America. That's the way it's described in 1988 by E.J. Montini in the Arizona Republic, to really a place for all people to come and try to imagine what future they can create for themselves. Schools such as Arizona State, U of A, NAU, they're leaders in the Southwest when it comes to education. Thousands of students come here yearly to see if they can advance opportunities by attending those facilities. We're leaders in healthcare. The Mayo Clinic has come here, and certainly through the engagement of a multicultural labor force, a multiracial labor force, has been able to establish Arizona as one of the premier destinations for medical tourism. And this even goes beyond when we start thinking about professional sports and the role that African Americans have played in turning Arizona into a sports mecca for this part of the country. In the 1980s, during the administration of Bruce Babbitt, the governor had established the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday without support from either voters or the state legislature. So when he left office, the subsequent governor, Even Meekum, he followed him into office and repealed the MLK holiday, much to the consternations of African Americans and their allies across the country. So Black Arizonans organized to protest this repeal and to have the holiday come before voters to determine if the state would acknowledge it. So by rallying corporate support from sponsors such as the NFL, Black Arizonans were able to push our voters to become the only state in the country to vote in favor of an MLK holiday. Every other place in this country has had it passed through legislation. But in Arizona, it's because the voters here decided that it was a holiday worth having. It's obviously a much deeper story than that, and it does get into a lot of, shall we say, corporate influence and boycotts, a la SB 1070. But I think what's really important in this sense to remember is that Arizona would have been on the opposite side of history in many ways, if not for Black Arizonans leading a charge to make sure that this holiday was passed. But by being on the opposite side of history, there are myriad opportunities, such as the Super Bowl, which has come here once, twice, I believe thrice, in the last 30 years that would have been missed out on if not for the fact that Black Arizonans stood in the gap and said, we're going to go in this direction, not just because it's best for us, but because it's best for everyone. And so in this sense, Black legislators, they've been critical to the advancement of our collected community. Venerated leaders in Phoenix, such as Calvin C. Good, have helped manage municipal affairs, and a younger generation, such as Mayor Corey C. Woods here in Tempe and Councilwoman Burdetta Hodge, they've continued efforts for equitable representation in surrounding satellite cities. I don't want to forget anyone in the East Valley, but Kiana Sears, along with Eliasa Sears, they've done an excellent job in Mesa. Trinae Nelson is on the school board in Kyrene District. There are so many Black leaders now, elected leaders, that it's difficult to keep track of all who are in office, something unfathomable years ago, which is why, for anyone watching, I apologize if you're watching and I didn't shout you out. There's really too many people to talk about. There's Mukhtar Sheikh in Balls District. There's Shelley Jackson in Roosevelt. There's Lawrence Robinson in Roosevelt as well. There's Onesis Strickham down in Chandler. I think Chandler also has a Black mayor right now. Lord forgive me, I can't remember his name. There are so many different folks who are involved in leadership now. and they moved the region, especially the East Valley, in a direction that has helped it become one of the fastest growing regions in the country. Moreover, black legislators at the State House, such as Art Hamilton, Reginald Boulding, and Leah Landrum Taylor, they've been able to ascend to the highest levels of leadership. Time and time again, they've proven to advocate not just on behalf of black Arizonans, but on all people in the state. And this, I argue, is the true legacy of Mary and Moses Green as trailblazers in a family that has contributed so much to our entire community. Most famously, Helen K. Mason, the great-granddaughter of Mary Green, is revered for her efforts to establish the Black Theater Troupe at Eastlake Park in Phoenix. Mason's mother, Susie Lewis Obey, was one of the first African-American children born in Tempe, and today her headstone lies with her husband and nearby her uncle at Tempe Double Butte Cemetery. If I'm not mistaken, the Greens also have a park named after them in Tempe, which goes a long way in recognizing the legacy that they've left here in this city. Joe Flipper, he was a teacher at Carver High School in Phoenix and an instructor at Glendale Community College. He followed in the footsteps of his great uncle, Captain Flipper, to serve the people of Arizona. And so what I'm going to conclude with is the idea that the experiences of these early pioneers can be difficult or even painful to envision. And while some of their descendants still reside among us, many no longer have bonds of blood that tie their legacy to the greater Salt River Valley. However, all of us, including elected officials and state employees, including business owners and workers, including university scholars and students of all ages, including homeowners, renters, even the unhoused, all of us are inheritors of the efforts that African American pioneers have made to improve our collective commonweal. And so our connection with them is an intergenerational mission to preserve, improve, and uplift our entire community. And just as they pioneered before us, we today are pioneers of the future. Thank you all so much.
Don't go away. I apologize. We're having a little bit of microphone issues, so I've got to stand up here. First, does anyone have any questions or comments they want to make? If not, yes. And I'm going to repeat it.
Julian School, so just to let you know, I didn't know Julian, and I know quite a few of the people you were talking about. Appreciate it.
She said she went to Julian School, and that's the same school that Dr. Pratchet went to. I've got to repeat it so that it'll go out on our stream. One thing that came to mind in this in your presentation was really a double standard. There are so many African Americans and other minorities that have contributed greatly to this state over time, and yet discrimination in terms of housing and in so many ways was still prevalent through much of Arizona's history. And I'm reminded of, I don't know if you come across him, Dr. Lucius Alston, who was a doctor in, an African-American doctor in Mesa. He came to the town in 1929, and up until that time, there was no African-American physician to serve the community. And he really couldn't have an office in the town center because of discrimination. So he was operating out of his home, which was in Washington Park, Escobedo neighborhood, just outside the town limits. And the ironic thing is that he proved to be one of the most capable doctors in the city. And although nobody would really give him credit for that, much of his practice took place after dark and around midnight, The whites in the community that were having health problems would come to his house and knock on the door at midnight, and it would be the back door, so nobody would see them going in or out. And yet, during the day, the discrimination continued. And I think there are many areas where there was exploitation of black talents where it was beneficial to the white community, but nonetheless, the discrimination continued. Any thoughts on that?
I would argue that in that sort of vein, this is why we have to consider the centrality of Black excellence to the development of this region. Perhaps there is an invisibility that's intentional because of how difficult perhaps it can be to see these things occurring above ground. If you think of what Arizona State is currently doing with their community-driven archives program, much of it, as I just kind of commented earlier, was built off the work of Dr. Marine, is that there is a dearth of archival information reflecting the experiences of communities of color. There are a lot of ways of looking at that. There's fingers that can be pointed, blame that can be assigned. I'm not sure that's necessarily what moves us forward, but I do know that there is a need, if we're going to truly understand what it means to live in this area, to try to find the narratives that are hidden and that are pushed to the margins. Because I believe that this is a much more complex and actually, I'll tell the story like this. When I lived back east, people would say it like, folks from the South are nice but not kind. People up north are kind but not nice. And folks from the West are neither. I believe that there is both a tradition of not just politeness but also kindness that exists in the state and a love for one's fellow human. But we need to move those stories to the center of our collective narratives because it's only through that type of love that then we'll be able to crowd out the hate that so often typifies our understanding of this place.
We're really in troubled times now. What with what's happening in the Middle East is dividing our country and other places around the world. Social media has allowed people to express themselves anonymously in ways that they couldn't do before. If you really, in the past, had enmity towards someone or a group, you had to express it and have some sort of identity. Now you can do it anonymously. And I'm troubled by where we are in this country today. But I would ask you what your assessment is of where we are today and what we can do to bring the peace and harmony that we should have, particularly at this stage of this country's development, moving forward.
Truth is its own antiseptic in that type of way, and it can lead to reconciliation. I must say that while I've spent decades, perusing what other people have thought and lived and experienced, I'm still myself quite junior and still learning about what it means to be human. I'd be very interested in hearing what some of the audience may think about that question in particular. Largely because of the wealth of experience that we have here, I'm curious as to how, not just what I've shared, but some of the ideas of what it means to highlight hidden histories or to speak names that have been, I don't want to say forgotten, but that have not been included prominently within our collective histories. How might that help heal some of the current issues that we're currently facing? I'm curious as to what the audience thinks on that.
Any thoughts? And also, I think the dichotomy today, one of the things that I just heard recently was the issues that are going on campuses now with regard, to racism and biases. And it's coming from an age range of, I think it was like 25 to 35, and that's surprising because traditionally, when we were desegregating the country, you weren't going to change the minds of people like in the audience. That was too fixed, and we started by working our way up with children that don't have those biases built in. And there's a maturity in this audience that may be different than the younger generation that's expressing a lot of those issues today. So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that, but there's a lot to think about in what Dr. Pratchet has said.
One thing actually I'd like to say about that, and I see the hand in the back, I really do want to make sure that we get a chance to hear from the audience, is that we have to remember that school desegregation was not easy. It was very painful, particularly for the children who are involved. Some of the stories that I've collected over the years, one of my elders told me about integrating a school in the South. All the students in the class were giving each other the answers to a test. All the white students wound up getting the answers correct. The black students got the answers incorrect. And then this elder realized that it was because the white students had given them the wrong answers to copy off of. Another one of my friends, I think in their family, they talked about how their parents moved them out of school as Anglo students because they were realizing that in their integrated school, black students were going around beating all the white kids up. That was the way that it was described to them. Another one of my elders described the issues, especially with interracial dating at Central High School during the 1980s when it was desegregating, that folks would get beat up on both sides depending on whose hands they were holding in the hallway, things along those lines. So I think the idea that children are more progressive intrinsically than their elders, it's just something that we need to be careful with. What we wind up seeing is the way that power is exercised within institutions, and children are acutely aware of the power inequalities that exist within the world. I mean, children are often at the receiving end of these inequalities. They're the ones who really have to live through them. They're the ones who have to live with it. So it's a question of how their responses are reflecting their understanding of how to navigate those inequalities, whether it's to lean into them and reinforce them or to rail against them and resist them. But in many ways, it's not so much about their progressiveness or reactionary nature. It's more so a question of what does it mean for the youngest of us to see the world that they're living in, to have to experience it, and then try to make an uninformed decision often, but the best decision that they can about how they'll respond to the structural concerns that they're seeing. I believe I saw a hand in the back.
I was just going to say that I think by sharing these different stories from so many different backgrounds, you realize that some of the struggles that we experience are very similar. We're not as different as we try to make ourselves out to be. And I'm not a person of color, but my brother and I were first generation Americans. Our parents were both prisoners of war. And yet, because we were deemed different, we were discriminated against by our colleagues in school. So I think by experiencing these experiences, we realize we're not as different as we make ourselves out to be. And I think it develops a sensitivity to each other.
Yeah, thank you for that. Basically, the comment is, even though there's a lot of disagreements amongst people, we're not as different as we try to portray ourselves to be. Is that adequate? Anything you wanted to add to that, or?
Yes.
To your comment before, my daughter is a school teacher, and she has told me on several occasions one of the challenges that teachers face. they get about 6 hours a day with a student to really help them along and build them up. And then there's 18 hours at home with a whole different message. And that's the challenge that we have, I think, within our school system.
I actually want to speak in particular to the Okemah community. I don't have all of the stories, but from what I recall, the transition to Tempe Elementary and Union was rough. One of the things that assisted those students was the hiring of Black instructors to help provide, in many ways, to help provide an environment that was more simpatico or amenable to not just their perspective, but also their humanity. I wonder what those experiences were like for those instructors, but I do think that there is a lot of value that can be derived from having people of different backgrounds, as was said in the back, working together to share their stories to come up with an understanding of their collective humanity. We all have to be, in this sort of sense, on the side of life, and not on the side of, hate and war and destruction. But it's only by coming together and figuring out how we're going to live together, and having people who are committed not just to doing that, but people from the disparate communities that comprise our civic body working together, that we have an opportunity to make this a place that works, not just for some, but for everyone.
And one more thing, with regard to the Okemah community, I was just at the Arizona Historic Preservation Conference, and there was a session on it. There is a book that's been recently published. I'm not sure how to get a hold of it, but the story of that community is really rather remarkable. So, again, we want to thank Dr. Pratchet for coming out. And hopefully, maybe for a return visit. And as we have a little token for you there, and we always try to provide something that is relative a little bit to topics, or at least to Arizona. And Richard Nearing was a dear friend of ours, a tremendous pen and ink artist who came to that much later in life, but he did a series of books and lots of illustrations, so we would like for you to have that copy of this book.
Thank you so
And again, we thank you for taking time and coming out today. Let me talk just a little bit about what's coming up next month. You might want to write this down because we normally haven't done things in December, but because the sign exhibit is closing in January, we're going to have a special presentation. Josh Rothler, who's over and the curator of collections and the curator of that exhibit, will be speaking with some half-baked hack, I can't read that name, J. Mark. I have no idea who he is, but they'll be combining, and I'm sure Josh will have a much better presentation than whoever this Mr. Mark guy is. That's December 13th, which is really a lucky Wednesday in December. Some other things, let me see. November 9th, that is tomorrow. Lately, the museum has been trying to make some of the historic homes that are within the city's possession open to the public, because the city has them to protect them, but also make them accessible. And to that end, tomorrow, the Eisendrath House will be open. It's a sunset affair from 5 to 7 p.m. Parking is a little limited, although you can park below by the Arizona Heritage Center and kind of walk up if you're able to do that. And that is free. If you haven't been to the Eisendrath House, it's a remarkable place, and it's has a really incredible story. And it follows a little bit in the footsteps of what Dr. Pratchet was talking about. In this case, it was discrimination against Jews in the valley at that time. November 18th, the Elias Rodriguez House will be open. This was an important home in the Mexican enclave. It's on Old 8th Street. And again, that is open free from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. And let me see, that's the two houses. November 29th, there's going to be a reception here for Signs of Tempe that will be presented by Tempe's Artists Guild. We partner with them once or twice a year, and they bring art to hang in this room, and that art will be centered around the Signs of Tempe. Also, Christmas at the Peterson House. That's a great time to see it in its best light. That's the first 3 weekends in December. The house is open from 11 to 3 p.m. on each of those weekend days, and it's all free, so there's no reason to not show up for that. Finally, it's hard to believe we're getting close to the holidays. But every year we have a program, the Larry Campbell Tree of Lights, where you can buy an ornament, and in honor or in memoriam for an individual that will hang on the tree over the holidays. We have regular ornaments, those are $10, and then some extraordinary metal ones. I don't think we have them out on display yet, but we will very soon, and those are $20. So that is essentially it. We hope that you'll come by next month. We're trying to get that out before the holidays and really learn why these signs in Tempe are so important and where they came from, who put them together. I think it'll be a great presentation, except for half of the presenters, but we'll deal with that next month. So once again, thanks to Dr. Pratchet. Thank you for coming out. Have a great Thanksgiving and observance of Veterans Day, and we'll see you the second weekend in December. Bye-bye.